All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome, and thank you so much for joining us today. This is a webinar on the topic of ORCID and NSPM-33, presented by the ORCID US community, which is a consortium of nonprofit ORCID members in the US, led by Lyrasis in partnership with the Big Ten Academic Alliance, the Greater Western Library Alliance, and the Northeast Research Libraries. Before we get started, just a few logistics. If you find that you need technical support on the webinar today, our colleague Shania is in the chat, so please send Shania a chat if you need technical support. Also, your microphone is muted, but please do feel free to use the chat box. And also there's a Q&A function for questions, and we will do Q&A at the end of the session. Everyone who registered for this webinar will receive the slides and the recording of this session afterwards. And if you're interested in more webinars on different types of topics, you can check out our Lyrasis learning platform. Some community norms for the call today. In this virtual space, we strive to engage in respectful discussion, which will mostly take place through the chat and the Q&A. So do ask questions and seek clarification and be receptive to feedback from others. And note that our ORCID US Community Code of Conduct is linked in the agenda document for this webinar that you can find linked in the chat. My name is Sheila Rabin. I am the program leader for persistent identifier communities at Lyrasis. So that includes our ORCID US community. And then we also have a DataCite US community for DOIs. Also on the call with us today is my colleague Paolo Guhilde, our ORCID US community specialist at Lyrasis. So together, the two of us provide support for over 175 organizations that are members of the ORCID US Community Consortium. We also have our featured guest speakers with us today from the University of Florida. We have Stephanie Gray, Assistant Vice President of Research and Director of Sponsored Programs at University of Florida. We also have Karen Pastos, Project Manager at UF Research. And we also have Jordan Edwards, Database Administrator and IT Analyst at UF Research on the call. And Jordan will be able to answer any more technical questions that might come up towards the end of the session. So after the session today, you should be able to understand the significance of NSPM-33 as it relates to ORCID, and also identify actions that you can take to help researchers prepare for NSPM-33 policies related to ORCID. And if you don't know what NSPM-33 is, don't worry, because that's the first thing we're going to cover. What is NSPM-33? How does it relate to ORCID? What actions you can take to prepare? And then we'll hear an example case study from the University of Florida, and we'll have time for discussion and questions at the end. So let's get started. What is NSPM-33? So NSPM-33 stands for National Security Presidential Memorandum, or Memo 33, and it's a presidential memo on United States government-supported research and development national security policy. This memo came out on January 14th, 2021. And the memo talks about a number of things, but for our purposes, we're interested specifically in what the memo says about digital persistent identifiers, or DPIs, they call them, for individuals. So notably, this memo in 2021 stated that within a year of the date of the memo, funding agencies at the federal level shall establish policies regarding requirements for individual researchers that are supported by or working on any federal research grant to be registered with a service that provides a digital persistent identifier for that individual. And they go on to say that basically they want all of the federal agencies to standardize disclosure processes. So when individuals go to apply for grant funding, they have that kind of initial disclosure, as well as annual updates if they receive funding and they have to do progress reports. And basically they say the agencies need to work on integrating digital persistent identifiers wherever appropriate and practicable, and should provide clear instructions to accompany these forms and to minimize any associated administrative burden. So that's pretty much all that NSPM-33 says about digital persistent identifiers for individuals. So let's look a little bit deeper on how this relates to ORCID. So when we talk about DPIs, digital persistent identifiers for individuals, there are a few common ones out there that are pretty well known. This graphic shows just kind of the top 3, I would say, in kind of the research scholarship space. So you're seeing ORCID first, which stands for Open Researcher and Contributor Identifier. So ORCID is open and community driven. It really is platform independent, so it can be used with lots of different systems and platforms, but it does provide that unique persistent identifier to help with name disambiguation for individuals. We also have Researcher ID, which is a proprietary identifier for individuals that is only used for unique persistent identification of individuals within the Web of Science platform. And then we also have Author ID, which again is proprietary and is only used within Scopus. But Researcher ID and Author ID can both be linked to an ORCID ID. So this is kind of an overview of like what some of the DPI options are currently. So knowing that, in January of this year, 2022, the National Science and Technology Council actually released a document that has more specific guidance for implementing NSPM-33. And so when we look at this more specific guidance, this is when we start to get into how does NSPM-33 relate to ORCID. Now, the guidance does not say ORCID, but if we read through what it says about DPIs, we can determine that they kind of are talking about ORCID here. So what does the guidance say about DPIs? They say that research agencies should work to implement DPIs into their electronic systems as quickly as is feasible. So they want this to happen as soon as possible. And that research agencies should allow submission of required disclosure information via a DPI service. And when we're talking about disclosure information, that's stuff like a researcher's affiliations, their past and current research activities, collaborations, those types of things. And the guidance goes further to explain how this DPI process would work. First, the researcher would maintain information on an individual profile or record that's maintained by a DPI service and associated with an identifier. And then during grant application process, the individual would provide their unique identifier and authenticate their identifier and authorize the research agency to access the required information through that identifier. And that would reduce any need for that researcher to manually enter information that they need for disclosures. So if you're familiar with ORCID at all, this is starting to sound pretty familiar to the process that ORCID follows. And we'll talk more about this. The guidance talks also about requiring a DPI versus just providing it as an option. So they say all research agencies should provide the option for researchers to use a DPI service for their disclosures. But they go on to say some agencies currently require the use of a DPI and many more may choose to do so. So for example, the National Institutes of Health, the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention, and the Agency for Healthcare Research and Quality, these agencies all already require ORCID IDs for certain types of grants. So research training, fellowship, research education, and career development awards. So that's just an example of some of the agencies that already require a DPI, in this case, specifically ORCID. And so we may see more agencies deciding to do this. And they also specify in the guidance that the individuals that should have the option to use a DPI for their disclosures are all individuals seeking or receiving federal funding. And they say that to the greatest extent possible, agencies should use a DPI service specifically that's already widely used by researchers. And what we can point out here, the image that you're seeing on the slide, is that there are already over 14 million ORCID IDs that have been registered. And ORCID is represented, researchers all over the world are using it, with the exception of 3 relatively small islands that you can see illustrated by the 3 red dots on this map. So ORCID is definitely widely used by researchers all around the world. Now here's the good part. So the NSPM-33 implementation guidance then goes on to list several common core standards that a DPI service should meet in order to be used in federal grant applications. So the first standard that they list is that the DPI service needs to be provided by an open, non-proprietary, researcher-driven platform, which ORCID is. ORCID is a global not-for-profit organization that's sustained by fees from member organizations. It's community built, governed by a board of directors. And so ORCID definitely meets that standard. The second one is the DPI service needs to be able to disambiguate one researcher from another and also allow for name variations to be included. And so ORCID definitely does that. The ORCID ID number is what helps to disambiguate people from each other, as well as information in individuals' ORCID records. And the ORCID record also has a place for other name variations in the also known as section, which you can see highlighted in the red box on this example here. More standards. The DPI service needs to enable a researcher to create a single record that represents their CV, basically, with relevant information that they can then share with funders, publishers, other researchers, and other organizations. And the ORCID record does just that. So ORCID records can contain biographical information, information about affiliations. So anything from employment to invited positions, distinctions, education, membership, service, all of those types of affiliations, funding that somebody has received, works that have been produced, peer review activity, and also research resources that people have used. So those are things like special labs or equipment or facilities like national laboratories and things like that. All of this information can be contained on an ORCID record, and it's very, very similar to a CV. More standards. They want to make sure that everybody basically only has one identifier. So they want the service to prevent unintentional creation of duplicate DPI records. And if somebody does accidentally have more than one, they can consolidate them into a single record. ORCID is set up to do just that. If you try to register for an ORCID ID and the email address that you use is already associated with an ORCID account, ORCID will flag that and say, hey, it looks like you already have an account. Also, if somebody has more than one, you can consolidate them basically into one. So another standard met. Furthermore, they want to basically look at using the DPI service and record to reduce administrative burden, allowing people to enter information once into their identifier record, and then sharing that information with research and grant agencies. And so the graphic here, many of you may have seen before, but this really illustrates the kind of interoperability, enter once, reuse often aspect of ORCID, where the researcher is in the center with their ORCID ID and their ORCID record. And as long as they're keeping information in their ORCID record up to date, they can send that data to their employer, to their publisher, to their funder. And subsequently, those organizations can also add information to the person's ORCID record to keep it up to date. And the whole idea behind this is to help save time and reduce that administrative burden of having to fill out forms over and over again. They also want to make sure that a DPI service provides the ability to exchange and make use of information from multiple systems, which ORCID does. One example of that is the ORCID search and link data sources that can be found in the works section when somebody's logged into their ORCID record. This list here, cross-ref metadata search, DataCite, PubMed, MLA, all of these sources and more are designed to work with ORCID to send works information to somebody's ORCID record. And this is just one example of the multiple systems that ORCID can interact with. They also want to make sure that the DPI service maintains the researcher identity and information over time and is inclusive of researcher name changes over time or different name formats. So again, that also known as section really comes into play. And this example here is illustrating that ORCID is also enabled to be used with multiple different languages as well. So different name formats, languages, formations, all of that can be tracked in an ORCID record over time. They want to make sure that research agencies can read and write validated information associated with the identifier. And the ORCID member API or application programming interface definitely allows for that. So ORCID member organizations can use the API to read data from an ORCID record and also write data to an ORCID record. So that standard is met. They want to make sure that the DPI service supports authentication services such as security assertion markup language or SAML, and also open authentication or OAuth. So ORCID does use SAML. That is one of the things that enables people to sign into their ORCID record using their institutional credentials. So that's the graphic you're seeing on the left. And then on the right, OAuth is basically the underlying mechanism behind the ORCID member API. So it's the mechanism by which researchers give access or approval to member institutions to read data from their ORCID record and write data to their ORCID record. They want to make sure that the DPI service is provided at no cost to the researcher. And this one is simple. ORCID is free for individuals. Anyone can get an ORCID ID. It's completely free of charge. And they want to make sure that the researcher has the ability to control access to their information and set their privacy levels and can specify who they want to share their information with. And this is a central tenet of ORCID, is that the individual researcher has full control over their ORCID record and the data within it. So what you're seeing on this slide are the visibility settings that the individual users can choose for each piece of information in their ORCID record. They can choose to have it shared with everyone, so publicly available on the web, trusted parties only, which are only organizations that they choose to share their information with, and then only me, which is completely private. So when it comes to those trusted organizations, that takes place through that OAuth process that we spoke about. So anytime an individual connects their ORCID ID with an organization, that organization will show up on the person's ORCID record as a trusted organization. And trusted organizations also have the ability to add information to individuals' ORCID records. So you're seeing a few examples here where the source of these pieces of information are an organization rather than the individual themselves. And that means these organizations used the ORCID member API to add this information to ORCID records. So that sums up the guidance. And all signs here are pointing to ORCID, even though they're not saying ORCID outright. Federal agencies are currently in the process of developing their DPI policies. And so what can we expect? Some agencies may have policies that specifically say ORCID ID, and they may require an ORCID ID. They may name ORCID ID specifically, but they may say it's optional. You don't have to have an ORCID ID. You don't have to use your ORCID ID, but you have the option of doing so, which, given that option, will save researchers a lot of time and effort during these application and disclosure processes. Some agencies may just keep it broad and continue to just say a DPI is required, but they may not specify ORCID, even though ORCID is really the only DPI that meets the requirements in the guidance. And then some agencies may keep it broad and say DPI, and that may be optional. So this is kind of what we can expect. We are currently waiting for agencies to come up with their policies so we can know exactly what researchers need to do when they're applying for funding. But kind of an example, a really good existing example of what we suspect things will look like more and more is Science CV. So if you're familiar with Science CV, it's a tool for creating a bio sketch when you're applying for a grant from the National Institutes of Health or the National Science Foundation. So these two agencies already allow you researchers to import data from ORCID into Science CV to save time and just keep things simple. So in the screenshot, you can see that a data source, an external data source that can be used is ORCID, so that you can basically import data from your ORCID record into Science CV. And you can even select specific items from your ORCID record to import to Science CV. So we're thinking that more and more agencies are probably going to go this type of route. Whether or not it will be required, we're going to wait and see. But in the meantime, Paolo is going to take us through some recommendations on actions that you can take to start preparing for these policies. Go ahead, Paolo.
Great, thank you, Sheila, and hello, everyone. So as Sheila mentioned, we're gonna go through what actions can we take to prepare for any possible changes with NSPM-33. So recently, last month, we actually published a blog post titled NSPM-33 and ORCID, Information for Research Organizations. So in this blog post, we basically just introduced NSPM-33. Sheila kind of did a lot of that earlier during our presentation today, but we also included probably the bulk of what my section is and what we're going to talk today on this part is the NSPM-33 and ORCID guide. So with this, we're just really kind of having a recommendations, kind of steps that we can take to prepare ourselves and your organization with NSPM-33. So that would be checking your ORCID membership, coordinate stakeholder support, consider technical integration, and educate through outreach. And we also talk a little bit about keeping track of NSPM-33, since this is a fairly new kind of guidelines that's still in process and still being worked on. We definitely need to keep track of this. So one thing that we normally would do, and this is what we usually do in ORCID US community, is any information or kind of relevant information to our ORCID US community members, we share them through our community discussion forum. So if you are a member, that's a member only discussion forum. So we do encourage that each organizations will have at least one of their ORCID contact, or if not, all of the ORCID contacts of your organization be part of that discussion forum. From time to time also, we will post changes and updates into our Twitter account, so you can follow us at US Consortium. We will also share information and email everyone through our open listserv. So this is a free subscription listserv and it's open to everyone. You don't have to be a member to be part of the listserv. So we're going to go through a little bit on our ORCID NSPM-33 and ORCID guide. Step one is to check to see if your organization is already an ORCID member. So there might be already staff members or researchers or librarians at your organizations that are already working with ORCID. So this is just a way for you to kind of find out what's going on in terms of ORCID membership at your organization. So if yes, for example, if you are a member, we encourage you to reach out internally to anyone that may be working on the ORCID at your organization. We recommend perhaps looking at your library, your librarians. Typically, a lot of our membership goes through the library, the university library, or libraries in different organizations. Or it could also be your research offices that may have the membership. So check with them to see if you are an ORCID member. If you are not yet an ORCID member, consider joining our listserv that I just kind of talked a little bit earlier to stay in the loop. With this, we will provide information there and send everyone information about any possible changes with NSPM33 and how that impacts the research cycle. With our guide as well, from each of the steps, we recommend some resources to check. So one of our recommendations for step 1 is to check your ORCID membership. So with this, we do have a listing of our members in our website at orcidus.lyrasis.org. With this, you will find a list of over 175 ORCID US members. So these are just some of our members, like Arizona State University, CSU Office of the Chancellor, and East Tennessee State University. And of course, our guest speakers today from University of Florida. University of Florida is also a member of the ORCID US community. Another resource to check is looking at the ORCID membership. So these are just what you would see here, like these 3 main benefits. So the discounted fee, 5 premium member API keys, and dedicated support staff. So these are your main benefits as a member of the ORCID US community or an ORCID member through the ORCID US community. So, and of course, there are other benefits that you can avail as well as a member of the organization. But we do encourage you to take a look at the membership page and just kind of take a look at what are the benefits as well as what the fees are in terms of your membership. Step 2 is all about stakeholder support. So with this, we encourage you to coordinate with other stakeholders at your organization to strategize about ORCID integration and adoption. So some of our organizations have actually created a committee across campus that have members from the library, for example, or from the grant management office, or from IT. So if we consider this, each unit of the campus will probably have different goals when it comes to ORCID. So for example, the library may be focused more on looking at the publications and integrating them into their institutional repository. The grant office may be focused more on the processes for grant management. So these kind of goals will help you think about what your next steps are when it comes to integrations and perhaps what your plan is for implementing ORCID at your organization. And again, these are just some of our resources. One of the things that we normally highly recommend to everyone is taking a look at our ORCID US planning guide. Similar to other guides that we have, this will just kind of take you to some recommendations to take. Really looking at stakeholder, thinking about the technical integrations and all of those things. And this is really a good start for everyone to really kind of start thinking about implementing ORCID, as well as looking at the different resources available when it comes to, when you're thinking about who to reach out to or what systems to think about. So that's a good start. Of course, we also have the one-pager for the value of ORCID. Basically, this will help you when you're approaching other stakeholders, and you can talk about ORCID and why is it beneficial for your organizations, why is it beneficial for the unit, and all of those things. And there's also that third resource there, which is more about partnering with internal stakeholders. So these are just approaches where you could basically get some kind of ideas and resources where how to approach stakeholders in your organization. Step 3 is our technical integration. With this, we highly recommend to take an inventory of institutional systems, platforms, or databases that could potentially write data to your researchers' ORCID records. So some systems like research information management, grant management systems, or publishing or repository systems are just kind of examples that you can take an inventory on and see what they are. and what their capabilities are. So when you do that, we do have a resource under common systems for ORCID integration. So with this, it's just a listing of different systems that could potentially have integrations with ORCID, or it would also give you information on whether or not they can actually integrate with ORCID. So an example that you will see here is Pure. So with this, that will give you an idea on what you need to do or what the capabilities are when it comes to an ORCID integration. So with this one, you will need, say, for example, a member API key to activate or enable the system. So this is actually, this system has a built-in integration to it. So all you really need is an API key. But it also gives you a little bit more details about whether it can connect with, you can sign in with your ORCID credentials or collect authenticated IDs. One of the things that Sheila mentioned earlier is talking about the DPI and NSPM-33 guidelines that's able to read data and also write data to that ORCID system. So that's really a way for you to do that through this API key as well. And in this listing, you'll be able to see whether or not that particular system that you are thinking of is able to do that. And of course, if it's not listed on this list, let us know and we will take a look at it further. And this is another resource on ORCID API basics. So Sheila kind of talked a little bit about this earlier, and really the basic idea of be able to connect with the system to your ORCID record, to the ORCID record, whether to able to read or write data, all of those things. And that's really sort of like your basic idea of the API, ORCID API. We also encourage you to take a look at the data fields page. In this, just kind of looking at what data is available within an ORCID record. So for example, with education, you're really looking at all the education affiliations that a researcher may have. So it could be, this researcher have worked at this university from this date to this date, and all of those kind of affiliations and other information there as well. So that's a good way to take a look at the data fields. We also have a custom integration guide. So with this, it's really about looking at different steps on how to do to build your own integration guide. One of the things to think about creating a custom integration is really, it is involved that you will probably end up to have a developer to be able to do some of the integrations that needed to be done. However, this particular guide, even though it says custom integration, you can actually this is useful in terms of looking at how exactly an integration works within ORCID. So this graphic here kind of tell you a little bit that you will need a front-facing kind of website or web page for your researchers to connect or log in or authenticate their ORCID ID. And then on the back end, it will kind of gives you an idea that once they do authenticate their ORCID ID or provide permission and authorize the organization that they can connect to the ORCID record, that the organization will have the access token and the authenticated ORCID ID. It's the access token that's needed to be able to write data, read data, and all of those things. So more on technical integration resources, we do have the ORCID US exemplars, which is a really good kind of resource for everyone to take a look at. So this will just gives you an idea of what other organizations, how other organizations are working with ORCID and how they integrated ORCID with their own systems. So whether that could be a vendor system or that could be a custom integration. Or it could also just be creating a committee, for example. So these are just some examples that we have that you can use in terms of looking at what other organizations are doing. And we also have the Affiliation Manager tool. And this is just a built-in tool that you can use to assert affiliation data to your ORCID, ORCID users. So this is much easier. You don't actually need the developer because this is built in within your member portal. And with this, if you want to use the Affiliation Manager, you will have to use one of your API key. And if you have any questions about Affiliation Manager and how this works, you can always give us a call, email us, and we can walk you through a lot of this kind of resources, as well as how the exact workflow goes. And we also have information, and one of the things that we actually do in the ORCID US community is creating a lot of resources for our members. One of those resources is this, the writing data to ORCID record. So it's a blog post about, how can you write data into an ORCID record, and what are the tools that you could use to be able to do that. So we've kind of mentioned a little bit about Affiliation Manager, vendor systems. So you have Pure, Explorer, for example. And this was also a community call we had in, I believe it was March, or April, where one of our use cases, Stanford University, talked about how they are writing data to ORCID records. And this is a good resource for you to take a look at and see how that works. And step 4. So this is our last step for our recommendation. So it's to really educate your researchers about ORCID. So you can have all of the technology that you have, and to be able to kind of connect all of that to ORCID. But it is really important that that researchers are actually using ORCID, and that they are populating some of the information in there. Of course, if you're writing data, you're populating it to your ORCID users as well. But it's really good that our researchers are able to also take a look at the ORCID record and populate some of those data for them and their ORCID record. So with that, looking at whether you have your researchers have ORCID IDs, looking at basically, information about how their ORCID records are being kind of pulled or written, all of those things are really important when it comes to outreach. So we do have a lot of outreach resources that you can take a look at. We have a community outreach planning guide that will help you plan out how to approach outreach within your organizations, and how to basically partner with other units perhaps, and make the outreach even better in terms of that. So all of this is really important. And we also have basically our blogs is really good in terms of like looking at how you want to present ORCID to your the value of ORCID to your researchers. And there's also a blog on ORCID and Science CV, which Sheila actually talked earlier about, and how all of that works. And finally, all of these recommendations, basically the different steps in NSPM-33 and ORCID guide, it's all about helping your researchers be more prepared for any potential changes that they may have to go through, or for any kind of things that required things that's needed because of possible guidelines and policies and all of those things. So really, ultimately, it's all about helping your researchers be more prepared. All right, thank you. And I will pass it on to our colleagues at University of Florida to talk more about what they're doing.
Thank you, Paolo. I think, Karen, if you want to go ahead and start the University of Florida slides. I want to thank the community for inviting us. I think what you'll find is at the University of Florida, very much of what Sheila and Paolo walk through with regards to sort of the awareness through a lot of federal changes in the landscape, all the way through to the outreach that Paolo referenced at the end. We're sort of mirror in a very short presentation for you, sort of our path through that process and where we landed and why. So thank you again. Karen, go to the next slide. Just for context, I think it's useful to note that the University of Florida, we are a land-grant university. We have a very broad, diverse set of faculty ranging from colleges of medicine, dentistry, veterinary medicine, as well as the College of Agriculture as the land grant, the space grant and sea grant as well, certainly ranging from astronomy all the way through the humanities and arts. So our faculty are very, very diverse in their endeavors. And our funding portfolio, specifically when you're talking about all these federal landscape changes, certainly that's the population we've been focused on. It's about 3,000 key personnel, and Karen Pastos, who will talk a little bit later, keeps track of that because we do a lot of outreach to that community on a frequent basis. And whether that's grants ending on any given day or week or new proposals being submitted, that number tends to stay pretty consistent for us and has over the last approximately 9 months. So we just crested the $1 billion in research expenditures this year. So that was a major milestone for us. And again, that ranges funders from NIH, NSF, DOE, who we talked a little bit about, IES, education, the College of Education, all the way through, as we affectionately like to call them, our specialty crop growers. We have the Strawberry Board and other local community groups that support research as well. So on to the next, Karen. I think it's useful, and I wanted to mirror a little bit of sort of what Sheila walked through, just to give some context for how we landed on our answer and when, and the timing of the projects that we'll sort of show the fruits of as we move forward. We implemented a grants management system, a new system in between 2014 and 2017. As part of that grants management system, we had a very intensive commitment to ensuring that the data that was in that system was available for broad reporting and usage. Certainly it was great foresight at that point. We didn't realize that this would be a potential use of it, but I think we believed that ensuring that all of the data elements in a flexible and extensible environment was a very, very valuable asset that we would later want to use. For those of you in the grants community, certainly there's what we affectionately calling the Lauer letters. NIH began contacting some of our peers in 2018 with regards to potential interest in some of our investigators and their international activities. Again, I don't think we completely foresaw the NSPM announcement that Sheila referenced in 2021, but certainly the landscape with regards to the federal funding environment and more transparent disclosure of faculty activities certainly was very prevalent in the radar of our federal sponsors, starting certainly much earlier than July of 2018, but that was really when the community started to realize that the federal landscape with regards to requirements and expectations of us was changing. And as that progressed, you really start to see each of the agencies requiring more and more consistent models and leveraging of tools like ScienceCV in their disclosure processes. We don't even list them all here, but certainly in April of 2022, the National Science Foundation released their draft of their proposal guide, which will be implemented in 23, and that explicitly called out ORCID as the tool. So we've evolved from October of 20 when the Department of Energy, and even back to July of 19, the announcement that NIH put out for training grants that Sheila had posted on one of her slides. The constant and growing leveraging of the ORCID as the source of that data, and really focusing on the data as the core and the data as the center of these disclosure requirements, not the format, but the data that really is the source of all of that. So I don't think we were sort of novel and aggressive in our thought and following that. I think many of our community, and I think the number of ORCIDs that are required, Karen will go through, obviously publishers were much earlier than the funders in this space, but I think we were following that along as a community. And then fortunate or not, the state of Florida has been more aggressive than some of the other US states in this as well. And Florida law required this kind of disclosure in July of 21. So we were in a position at that point as the institution to convene a task force to try to be responsive to the Florida law, which I think put us on a much more aggressive path to the solution that you'll see today. Karen Pastos was brought on in October of 21, and I think what you'll see is, in a very quick timeline, she has been able to implement the core of a lot of the tools that we hope will, again, be extensible to many of the different data types, but certainly we'll demonstrate the first data type that we selected in a little bit. Karen, go to the next slide. When we brought Karen on, her charge was to help us to build tools to reduce the administrative burden. And I think this is where you'll see us very aligned with the tenets of ORCID and its model, right? We wanted to leverage data. We wanted to assist researchers. We wanted to make data transparent. We wanted to reduce burden and also give the power to the researchers. So I think this is where our commitment and early decision to go with ORCID, because of our two goals and watching the changing landscape of the federal government, was certainly aligned. I think the other thing that we made a commitment early on, I think many of our partner institutions have RIMS tools or tenure and promotion tools that do a lot of collection. We made the commitment that is because we're a very diverse institution, we have a number of those solutions, and then rather than to try to undertake the political sort of steering institutionally to adopt a single tool, we would leverage what was available and try to, again, embrace the tenet of ORCID and leverage deduplicating and creating a canonical source that wasn't necessarily institutionally driven, but publicly available and really at the researcher's control. So Karen, on to the next slide. Through all of that, right, and based on our goals and based on the sort of landscape, we decided to leverage ORCID as our both sort of source and answer for our faculty is reduction in burden, rather than building our own or paying for another RIMS option institutionally. Thought it was a quicker adoption. The infrastructure was already there, and seeing where the federal agencies were going and the Science CV implementations that have evolved through discussions with the Federal Demonstration Partnership, we believed, and I think we guessed and sort of put our money right a little bit here, that investing in ORCID as the answer rather than curating our own data sources was going to be the best payoff for our investment. We also chose as our sort of pilot, which you'll see in just the next slide, to focus our first integration with our grants data. I know certainly I saw Stanford has done a lot on the directory data. We did that for 3 reasons. I think we saw that the frequency of changes in the grants data was more than what would normally happen in someone's job changes. And as such, the better payoff for the faculty with regards to data entry was to leverage the grants data rather than employment data. We also solved an existing problem, which was to try to ensure that proposal data, pending data, even though it is not currently listed in ORCID, it helped us to maintain the quality of our grants data because our faculty were actually looking at the data and helping ensure accuracy, as opposed to us from an institutional administrative standpoint. It was one more reason for the data to be accurate, is because the faculty were actually looking at it more regularly. And then finally, we did it as a result of our breadth of our funding portfolio. We currently have 1,700 different sponsors funding the university, and not all of those are sources to the kinds of wizards that that ORCID provides, just due to the obviously the breadth of what that would require. As such, we again found that there, rather than publications or outcomes or other things, we found that grants data was a space where we could really provide trusted and real-time data to the faculty's profile as our first sort of pilot to, again, buy ownership of the faculty in engaging with us through the process. The third decision we really made was, Sheila mentioned it a number of times, right? The central tenet of ORCID is the researcher control, the researcher maintenance. And so we made the decision that the researcher really has the ability to send or update data at their own frequency, and that wouldn't be a sort of institutional push across the board, but each data transaction would be fully within the control of the faculty member. And that certainly supports the researcher being at the helm of their own ship of their ORCID record, will provide tools and assets for them to be able to do that effectively, but really wanted the researcher to be in control because ultimately they're going to have to certify the data. And we really wanted that to be an important part of the process. So that was a lot of the backstory on sort of where we landed and why. And I will turn it over to Karen, who can talk about some of the details of the actual tools that we are now using to support our faculty.
Okay, so the University of Florida became an ORCID member in January of 2017 via our libraries. And then 5 years later, in January of this year, the UF Research Office began working on our custom integration with ORCID using one of the 5 member API keys that we received with our membership. Our integration was approved in March, and outreach efforts began in April and continued while we created what we call the UF Orchid Portal. This portal is essentially a dashboard that allows connected users to view and send information from our grants management system into their ORCID records. And I'll show you what this portal looks like in a few minutes. So far, the portal displays awards and pending proposals on which the user is listed as key personnel. And as of today, we have only a few months after going live, we have 3,000 users who have made the connection and added the University of Florida as a trusted organization on their ORCID records. It's worth mentioning that UF has not mandated any individual to connect their ORCID ID to UF. Our success in these numbers is solely rooted in the relationships we have with our faculty and researchers and the value prospect for these faculty that this will ease their burden in the long run. So here's a snapshot of the main ORCID at UF page on our research site. It provides the link for researchers to create and link their ORCID ID to UF. So if a user clicks here on this big orange button, it begins the process of connecting their ORCID ID to UF, and the process takes less than a minute. After clicking on the orange button, the user will log into our site using their UF credentials. On the back end, we are using this login to link their UF ID to their ORCID ID. After logging in, the user is taken to a page where they will click this blue button to initiate the OAuth workflow between ORCID and UF. The next window is where they can sign into ORCID or register now if they don't already have an ORCID record. And the last step is to authorize access to the University of Florida. This final step allows us to store their ORCID ID in our database. And when this is done, their ORCID ID is posted to UF's master data management system and is linked to the user's UF directory information. Other UF IT systems are now able to access the ORCID ID for other purposes, such as displaying on faculty web pages. So this completes the OAuth process, and the user will now see that the University of Florida is listed in their trusted parties within their ORCID record. So once folks have connected their ORCID ID to UF, they will have access to the UF ORCID portal. Clicking on that orange Create Connect button on the UF ORCID page will now take the user to this portal page. The page contains 2 tables as of right now. We're adding more, but right now we have the awards table and the pending proposals table. And these data that are displayed in the tables come directly from our UF grants management system. Changes to proposals and awards are reflected in real time, so the portal will always display the most recent status updates. The awards table displays all awards on which the user is or was key personnel, as it includes active and expired data. The proposal table displays all pending proposals on which the user is key personnel. So a closer look at the portal's award table shows how the user can send an entry to their ORCID record. If an award has never been sent to ORCID from the portal, the user will see the Send to ORCID button. And if the award has been sent to ORCID previously, the user will see the Update ORCID button and also the date timestamp of when it was last sent to ORCID. There's a couple of reasons why someone might want to resend their award entry to their ORCID record. They might have deleted it in their ORCID record by mistake, or there might be an update to the award data, like a change to the end date or a change to the total award amount. In order to send funding information from UF to ORCID, we had to make a change to our sponsor attribute table in PeopleSoft. Prior sponsor information did not include research organization registry numbers or ROR numbers. So we had to backfill ROR numbers for all of our existing sponsors, and now going forward, we include a ROR lookup for all of our new sponsors. So when we look at a funding record in ORCID that came from UF, we see something like this. Here you can see that the source for this entry is listed as the University of Florida, and the data highlighted in yellow came from our UF grants management system. And here is that ROR number that we talked about that links to the sponsor name and other organization identifiers provided by ROR. So there's currently 3 ways for our users to populate their funding information in ORCID. They can use a search and link wizard, which is Dimensions Wizard within ORCID. They can use the University of Florida's Orchid Portal, or they can do manual entry. The UF Orchid Portal data sends a more complete list of awards than the search and link method, as Dimensions Wizard does not store award information from all possible sponsors. Like Stephanie said, we have 1,700 possible sponsors at the University of Florida. Using the UF portal also eliminates the need for doing multiple searches in Dimensions Wizard, as our portal will display all awards on which the user is key personnel, as opposed to all awards on which they are PI. We've also found that changes to grant information like end dates and total funding do not always get updated in Dimensions Wizard data, and then in those cases, the UF grant data is going to be more accurate. So here's an example of where a funding record was written to a user's ORCID method via 2 API clients, the University of Florida and Dimensions Wizard. ORCID uses the grant number, in this case the FAIN number, to identify duplicate entries, which are automatically grouped together in the ORCID record user interface. If one of the entries had been added manually by the user, the manual entry would default to the preferred source. But in the case above, both entries were added via an API client, so the default preferred source is set to the one that was added first. And the user can make the preferred source change by clicking on this button. At the University of Florida, we store information about the sponsor at the most granular level possible. So for this particular award, we have the sponsor listed as NASA Stennis Space Flight Center, whereas Dimension Wizards lists the sponsor as NASA. So the user now has an option of how they would prefer to have the sponsor listed in their ORCID record. So next I'm going to talk about the 2 other features of our portal, effort commitment and pending proposals. ORCID does not currently accept either of these, so there's not an option to send this information to ORCID, but these data are needed for current and pending support forms for proposal and award processes. This slides demonstrate the effort commitment section. Within the portal, a user can click on this button here to bring up a nested effort commitment table for that award. And this nested table displays effort months for each effort period. In this case, this award is a 5-year award, so there's 5 effort periods. The other table in the portal is the pending proposals table. This displays all pending proposals on which the user is key personnel. If the user sees a proposal in their table that needs a status update, they can click this Alert DSP button to update the status to not funded. And as I mentioned before, ORCID does not currently accept effort commitment or pending proposal information, but these data elements are part of the current pending forms that are required by sponsors. So our portal is designed to, 1, act as an interface for users to send information to their ORCID, and 2, obtain information in one dashboard view that will help them with their required grant forms. And we did make it so that all of our tables in the portal are exportable to Excel. So we've tried a variety of outreach methods, and we've learned that the majority of our researchers already have an ORCID ID. our targeted emails from UF research have been the most effective in getting people to connect their ORCID ID to UF. Of the 3,000 people who have already made that connection, about 2/3 are currently key persons on federal awards and proposals. The other third comprise faculty, staff, and students who heard about the initiative through some of these other outreach efforts. We have ongoing outreach efforts as well as plans for the future outreach, especially as the fall semester begins in late August. So that is a snapshot of what we've done over the last 6 months. While we've found it to be relatively easy to get our researchers to create and connect their ORCID ID to UF, we know there is a lot of work still to be done. Our future efforts will continue to focus on preparing for federal-wide changes in response to the NSPM-33. We're exploring ways to leverage other institutional data to help researchers manage their ORCID record. Ultimately, this will help our researchers be ready for the federal sponsor mandates regarding Science CV. And as I mentioned earlier, most of our researchers already have an ORCID ID, as it was required when they submitted a publication or served as a reviewer for a journal. However, most of our researchers do not have well-populated ORCID records. So our engagement with our researchers regarding the use of ORCID has shown us where there are some opportunities for awareness and education. And I've listed some examples of where our researchers have knowledge gaps: how to use the search and link wizards within ORCID, how to manage and benefit from trusted organizations, how and when to set privacy settings on ORCID entries. For instance, in order for the integration with Science CV to work, their information must be set to trusted parties or public rather than private. And finally, how ORCID integrates with Science CV. And it's worth noting that to better inform our researchers about ORCID, we are partnering with many other people across campus, such as our librarians, our editors, grants administrators, and more. And that's all we have for today. I hope this presentation about our efforts here at the University of Florida has been helpful. And I'll turn it back to Sheila now to start the Q&A session. Myself, Stephanie, and our database administrator, Jordan Edwards, will take any questions that you have.
Wonderful. Thank you, Karen and Stephanie. We do have some questions that have come in through the Q&A box as well as the chat. So let's go ahead and take a look. First question, what awards system does University of Florida use?
We adopted the Huron Research Suite. We implemented in 2014 in our quite custom version, but it is the Huron Research Suite.
Great. Some more University of Florida specific questions. So University of Florida has a button for faculty to update the ORCID record for something like a change in funding amount. Is there a reason that you don't send those updates automatically since the user's already granted you write access?
So I'll take a first shot and then more context later. So hi, Steve. I think our initial implementation, we really sort of stuck to the sort of user control tenet quite literally. Certainly we've discussed whether or not once we've been given write access, how broadly to extend that. But I think in early stages, we really, as Karen indicated, the faculty engaging in the curation of their own records and really embracing the constant return to these types of portals as a management tool was an early decision. Now we certainly are going to pay attention to that and consider whether that is useful or not. I think as we move forward, we are open to discussing with our faculty the automatic pushing of data, but we really stuck to the faculty control tenet during our initial implementation.
Great, thank you, Stephanie. And then we have another. So it sounds like University of Florida researchers are incentivized to connect their ORCID to UF by the ability provided in that case to push awards data to their ORCID profile. Is that correct? Or can UF researchers utilize the portal to push award system without connecting to UF? If I'm understanding that correctly. The question is basically, do researchers have to connect their ORCID to University of Florida in order to have their awards pushed to ORCID?
Correct.
And I believe the answer is yes.
Yep.
Yes.
And then that has to do with the trusted
Yes.
organizations. And like Karen said, I think there's a learning opportunity there for our faculty and leveraging sort of what does trusted organization mean in the ORCID framework, I think is something we are leveraging certainly, but I do think there was a lot of education that we had to go through to get through what does it mean to be trusted? What does that mean we can do for you? This is the value of being a trusted organization. So yeah, I think absolutely the answer technically is yes, but I think that was an educational challenge for Karen as she navigated.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay, more questions. Would UF be willing to share the ROAR to sponsor mapping? Our conventions can vary on sponsor name, but I bet a lot would be exact matches. This is from Christopher Dorney at Boston University.
Yeah, we'd be happy to share. We did. I think, as all of us know who have managed sponsor data, there's different granularity. You know, certainly we work in PeopleSoft, and there's field size limitations, and ours might not match. But if you've got some scrubbing that you're willing to do, I think we'd be happy to share the work that we put in.
Awesome. Another question from the chat. For grants financial management, is UF using PeopleSoft?
We use it for our financial management, but we have a non-financial management from which all of the data comes, and that is Huron.
Okay, great. Okay, let's see. I think we're okay. I'm seeing if there's any more UF specific questions, and there are, so I'm just going to keep going with these. I'm fine with UF as a trusted organization to push award data to ORCID. My ideal would be open infrastructure in the control of individual researchers to get their award data from UF's grant database and then push that data to ORCID on their own. I guess that's more of a comment. So I'll just leave that there and we can record that. Just to make sure only faculty can click the button to send their data to ORCID, correct?
Karen, do you want to take that one?
Sure. So right now, the user that is signed in is the only one that can send information to their ORCID record. However, Jordan is working on creating a proxy system, much like ORCID has, where somebody can delegate another person within our system that they can go in and do that for them. Jordan, I don't know if you want to talk about that a little bit more.
All I can say is that it is still under active development.
Okay, great. Okay, so now we have some other more kind of broad questions that we can all work on answering. Has ORCID or anyone else heard anything more recent about the NIH support in Science CV? I have not heard any updates lately, but if anyone else has, feel free to type that in the chat, or if any of our University of Florida folks have heard anything, feel free to speak.
Yeah, and I guess more recent than ... I think would be my question. Certainly we are hearing from the community that the harmonization efforts are supposed to be released yet this summer, and that the federal-wide harmonization forms between NIH, NSF, DOE, and the partnerships seem to be leaning towards a single Science CV implementation. And I know at the last FDP meeting, the developers for Science CV and NSF were all on board and seem to be indicating that without any official federal commitment. So I think we are all awaiting anxiously the harmonization to be released, the draft harmonization this summer.
Awesome. Thanks, Stephanie. That kind of goes along with the next question, which is, have there been any timelines proposed, mentioned, targeted for that implementation of the digital identifiers? I think Stephanie just answered that in terms of the agencies are working on it, and within the next several months to a year, we should have more information. We all know things can sometimes move more slowly than we would like, but we're aware of what's going on, and so we can just keep an eye on things. Okay, how do you handle duplicated grant items in the faculty ORCID profile if faculty don't want to do the additional work, like going in and choosing their preferred source? I can speak to that in terms of if the same grant was added from multiple sources, as long as it has a grant ID, a grant number, some sort of identifier, ORCID will automatically group those items together. And so that can kind of help keep the profile more clean with less duplicates. If the grant items do not have those identifiers or grant numbers, or if one of them does and another one doesn't, they will just stay as duplicates in the ORCID record. So the researcher, if they don't want to have duplicate items appearing, they will need to go in and take a look at that and either set them to different visibility settings so that only one appears, or delete one if they don't want that on their record. But ORCID does a great job of identifying and automatically grouping duplicates together as long as those identifiers are present. Okay, so the included pending proposals and effort commitment data appears to be there for reference when completing other support current and pending. Is that still manual data entry into Science CV, and is that done by administrators or directly by researchers? That's a great question. I don't know if Stephanie or Karen, you want to speak to that?
Yeah, it is still manual at this point. Again, I think as we indicated, we're trying to feed accurate information. So again, that's one step that we're trying to improve the burden on, and in the hopes that in the long run, those become data that are available through these types of tools and systems to exchange. So we're providing at least a view now, so the data is accessible to the faculty. And my guess is it varies whether administrators or researchers are doing it, just based on the varying support levels of the unit and the faculty personal interest and control over the process.
Yes, thank you, Stephanie. And I know that individuals can delegate somebody else to create their Science CV form for them, as well as delegating trusted individuals within ORCID too. So but yeah, the pending grants are not really something that is tracked in ORCID, and not the effort and commitment as well. That's not tracked in ORCID right now. But good to keep track of it, and I think it's a good idea to see it on the UF portal. Okay, could you please talk about the timeline for a university to become a member from applying to the implementation and integration stage? I can speak to that. So any nonprofit organization in the US can become a member of ORCID through our ORCID US Community Consortium. Basically, there's just some paperwork that you have to fill out to start the membership. So at many universities, that sometimes has to go through a procurement process. So however long your procurement takes is how long it will take to get the membership set up for you. And you can choose your start date, and you would work with Paolo and myself to get that set up. Once you are a member, you have access to 5 API keys that you can use to integrate with your local systems. Your ability to use those API keys is really just going to vary depending on the specific systems that you're using. So some campuses are using vendor systems, like Paolo mentioned. Pure has an ORCID API functionality built in that you can just turn on. Of course, you have to make your researchers aware that that integration is available. So that can take some time. Or if you want to do a custom integration, that really will just depend on, do you have a developer available to work on that? Are there any other competing priorities or projects, and how that time and resources might be allocated? So it really varies widely. I have seen a new member organization come on, and then 2 weeks later, they have a custom ORCID integration because they had a developer that could focus solely on that and get it done. And then they do a very targeted outreach and get people to start using it within a very short amount of time, 1 to 2 months, getting thousands of connections there. Other places, it can sometimes take years. So it really just kind of depends on the context of your organization, the resources that you have available, and also the systems you're using, and kind of what your goals are for what you want to do. Maybe Karen or Stephanie or Jordan can speak a bit about the timeline for, how long it took you to get your integration kind of up and running, and getting those thousands of ORCID IDs connected, if you have any ideas about that.
So it only took us about 2 months to get the integration up and running from when we started. It helped that we already had the ability to access one of the member API keys. And we got to 3,000 within maybe four months or so of going live. I believe we opened it up to our researchers in early April, and the majority of that happened within of those 3,000 happened within the first couple of months. We have not done any really big pushes lately, but just through word of mouth and Google searches and the folks that we're working with across campus that are helping advocate for this cause, we still get probably 10 or 15 people make their connection each day.
Wonderful. Thanks, Karen. And that kind of relates to the next question, which is, if you could speak a little bit more about that outreach that you've done. Did you target individual researchers or departments? If so, how did you choose whom to target? It sounds like maybe you didn't really do that because it's just kind of been an organic process, but if you could say a little bit more about your outreach, that would be helpful.
So we started by partnering with our associate deans for research in each of the 16 colleges that we have. And we had a template email that we asked them to send out to their faculty, postdocs, graduate students, whatever they had as a kind of their research listserv. And that was fairly effective. At least we kind of got the word out that there's stuff going on with ORCID. We did some presentations, some tabling at research poster events during the spring. But it wasn't until we started sending out these targeted emails to all of our key persons on federal awards and proposals that we started getting these huge numbers of people making their connection. So the reason I think that we were successful with that was, one, it was coming from an office that they had a lot of interaction with already, right? They hear from our research office a lot regarding their grants and their proposals. We made it super easy. The process really takes, we say less than a minute, but it really takes about 20 seconds. We gave them access to a portal, and I think because of those things, we were able to get these numbers.
I'm gonna, only because Karen won't say this. So Karen Pastos has been a member of the University of Florida research community for many years and had very well-established connections, specifically within our health science center, and had been working with the deans and a lot of those folks on initiatives. And so leveraging her relationships and finding the connections and the networks that exist already, or that as opposed to a blanket email from an administrative office, I think was critical to the adoption being so successful at the university.
Great, thanks, Karen and Stephanie. That makes a lot of sense. Okay, let's see. There had been a question previously about DOIs and ORCID. I'm not sure if I'm fully understanding the question, but Crossref and DataCite are two DOI registration agencies that are integrated with ORCID. So if a researcher logs into their ORCID record and connects with the Crossref and DataCite search and link wizards in the works section of their ORCID record, any items, works that they have that have a DOI, if their ORCID ID is included in that DOI metadata, Crossref and DataCite will automatically add those works to the person's ORCID record. But the person has to kind of authorize that connection first before that will take place. And then if changes occur to the DOI metadata, that kind of just stays within the DOI. So the metadata that's within ORCID, work metadata within ORCID, if it contains a DOI, that link is there. But ORCID is not necessarily pulling in metadata from those DOI records. It's kind of up to Crossref and DataCite to push those if there are changes. Users of ORCID do get notifications anytime something is added to their ORCID record through an API integration. Users have control over their own notification settings. So depending on how the user has set their notification settings, they may or may not get an email that also tells them, hey, this item has been updated on your ORCID record. I hope that answers that question, but if there are more questions about this, definitely contact us and we can go into more depth there. I'm seeing another question about open infrastructure. So can there be a collective movement toward open sourcing the integrations so that all institutions could contribute and share instead of reinventing the wheel? I think if I am reading your question correctly, code for these ORCID integrations, there is open source code available out there. Like, for example, DSpace repository software, the latest release 7.3 has a built-in ORCID integration, and that software is open access, open source. So that could be reused. Another benefit of our ORCID US community is that we kind of are able to facilitate sharing and talking to each other, sharing code if that is something that people are interested in and would be helpful. But, different institutions, have different existing infrastructures and developers using various languages. And so, sometimes it's helpful to do that kind of sharing, and then other times it's not. It just kind of depends on how the institution wants to approach ORCID, what type of data they want to add to ORCID records, what systems they're using, where they're getting that data, and then, how the developers are working. So while everybody kind of has a similar wide, broad goal, getting there can take somewhat of a different path depending on each institution and the specifics there. But Michelle, if you're interested in speaking more about this idea of open source and sharing integrations, also definitely contact us and we can go more in depth there with you. Okay, another question. Where is the search and link feature in ORCID? I'm logged in and it's not on the top menu. When I go to trusted parties, okay. So basically when you are in the main area of your ORCID record, when you're logged in, you would scroll down to the works section. So you would act as though you're going to add a work to the works section of your ORCID record. When you click on the plus sign to add a work, one of the options that you'll see in the dropdown that appears there says search and link. When you click on search and link, it will take you to a list of all the different databases that you can basically authorize to add data to your ORCID record. And then when you go in there, you can search for your works in each database and have them sent to ORCID. Thank you, Paolo, for putting the instructions in the chat there. So there is a documentation on how to use those search and link wizards. Okay, we have about 4 minutes left. Are there any, thank you everyone for, all of these great questions. Are there any additional questions? And if you want to chat more with us, or if you think of questions after this, email us at orcidus@lyrasis.org, and we're more than happy to work with anyone with any questions you might have. Just noting some comments in the chat. The ORCID Affiliation Manager that Paolo mentioned earlier, it's a great way to start adding affiliations to your researchers' ORCID records if you don't have a developer that can work on a custom integration. And yes, the comment about sometimes you can, have an integration available and people may not be aware of it or may not use it if they are aware of it. So setting those kinds of cultural norms in terms of, hey, just reinforcing that people can use their ORCID record with your local systems once you have an integration is really important. And then also, yes, having requirements from publishers and from funders, and sometimes from the institutions, that can make a big difference as well in terms of getting more people to pay attention and use their ORCID record and connect it to your integrations. Any last remaining questions? Here's one. Are there plans, dimensions to expand award link wizard? So the dimensions wizard is the search and link wizard that is available in the funding section of ORCID, of the ORCID record. I don't know of any plans to expand that. If anybody else does, feel free to let us know. But right now, the Dimensions Wizard, it's a database of funding awards, although it is not comprehensive by any means. It has limited award sources and also limited years in terms of when awards were granted. So it's a nice tool, but it doesn't necessarily have everything. Thank you, Brian. The expansion depends on digital science's priorities. So you might contact Digital Science. They manage the Dimensions Wizard. Okay, well, that brings us to the end of this session. Thank you so much, everyone, for sticking around with us, asking your questions. Many thanks again to our guest presenters, Stephanie and Karen, and also thank you to Jordan for being here and for developing the University of Florida ORCID integration. Everyone, please just stand by for the recording and also the slides from today's session. And feel free to reach out and get in touch with us if you have any other questions. Thank you so much, everyone. Okay. Shania? I'm just copying the questions out of the Q&As to put them in our notes document, and then I'll clean them up. I just wanted to make sure we got all of them. And then let's see, there were a few questions that were asked in the chat.
Yeah, I'll get the
Shania, are
questions
you-
from the chat.
Okay, thanks, Paolo. All right, well, I guess that does it. Great.
Let's see.
Thank you, everyone. Have a great day. All right, Paolo, I'm gonna drop off.
Okay. Thank you.
I will chat you on Slack.
Great. Thank you. Talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm
All
still
right.
trying to get
All
all of
right,
this.
bye. All the chat.
Yeah, I think Shania, I think I'll email Shania. She could probably give us also the text of the
The
chat.
chat log. Yeah,
Mm.
that's
right.
probably a good idea.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll coordinate on Slack. Thank you, Paolo.
Thank
you
you.
later.
All right. Talk soon.
Bye.